Hello, everyone. Welcome now to the third part of our first lecture in this Introduction to Phonology. And we can now begin with our first steps towards conducting some phonological analysis in trying to determine the phonemes of a language. Before we can do that, of course, we need to try to say what a phoneme is. Now, phonemic analysis, the process is involved with trying to discover what the distinct and contrastive sounds of a language are, on the one hand, namely, as we'll see, the sounds that native speakers take to be actually different sounds in a language, and what the major variants of those sounds are, namely the really, phonetically describably different ways in which those contrastive sounds can be realized. So to get an idea of what we mean by contrast here, let's try to use an analogy. So for instance, let's say that I can write a number 1 or a number 7. So here we can see in this font, there's a number 1 written and there's a number 7 written. I can also use this little pen function here to write a 1 and a 7. And I can try to write another 1 and another 7. And yeah, they turn out a little bit different. And in trying to write these symbols for these different numbers, we are taking these, we already have these categories of the two numbers, 1 and 7. And so when I write these things, we take them to be different. But every time each person in their own individual handwriting is going to write the numbers 1 and 7 a little bit differently. And especially when we have to use some strange computer tools, they will look even more different. And there will even be every time a person has to write the symbol for a 1 or the symbol for a 7, the result is going to be very, very subtly different. So for some instances from handwriting, so some handwriting styles might write the 1 as just a straight line, or as we can see in this font, the 1 could have a very small mark at the top. And in some styles, say the top of the 7 will be flat, or it might have a slight curve to it, as it does in the font that I'm using for producing this handout. But what we can say for the most part is that because we've developed the ideas of these contrastive categories of a symbol for a number 1 and a symbol for a number 7, we mostly don't have any trouble distinguishing when a number 1 has been written and when a number 7 has been written. So in that sense, we can say that the symbol for the number 1 and the symbol for the number 7 constitute categories. They are contrastive. There are lots of different variants for these categories. As I said, the way in which each person's handwriting shows a number 1 and a number 7. Those can be taken to be variants, but we can recognize them as a 1 and a 7. And somehow human brains are very good at developing the capacity for categorizing entities, for saying, that's an instance that is an exemplar of a number 1, whereas this other thing over here, that's an instance or an exemplar of a number 7. And a problem for computers, a problem of what we can call machine learning, is trying to train them to accurately distinguish between a 1 and a 7. Now, there are lots of good machine vision programs, which, for instance, are used in mail services, which are good at recognizing numbers. And now that we've made this small analogy, we can take that over into a system of sounds and say that a phoneme, in the context of some specific language, so in the context of a specific language, be it English, German, Russian, Spanish, Hindi, will be a basic contrastive sound in that language. And so for a particular language, and for any given language, all of the words that that language possesses can be described as sequences of phonemes. And the phonemes are going to have all the sounds that a native speaker will recognize as contrastive, all the sounds that a native speaker perceives as being distinct sounds. Now, if you take the words of a specific language and you were to transcribe the words in detail in multiple speaking styles, those would show lots of different sounds, thousands of audibly distinct sounds. For most speakers, that information about those variants in sounds is completely filtered out, and they simply perceive the categories. But each of those audibly distinct sounds, some of those small differences that you could see on a spectrogram, for instance, if you want to look into the acoustics recording, we would call that an allophone. Now, when we do phonemic analysis here, we're only going to be talking about the major allophones of sounds, things that are really quite clearly perceptibly different and not just subtly different, for which you would need a very fine phonetic transcription to say, yes, that is a different sound. So I've just introduced this term allophone now, and let's try to see what that is. Well, we can see, again, in terms of the etymology, we recognize that Greek base phone, sound, and we have another Greek component, allo, the adjective allos, meaning other. So allophones, literally speaking, are other sounds. And here we first need to try to distinguish some different levels of representation. So when we refer to a sound outside of its status in a specific language, it's appropriate to refer to that as a phone or just a sound, which of course is, as we've said, is what phone means. So in a very general sense, we can talk, I'm going to zoom in on this text file so that you can see. So in a very general sense, we can talk about sounds like a voiced bilabial stop or a voiced labiodental fricative, or say, let's find, let me think of another somewhat more. Say a voiceless retroflex sibilant fricative. Those would all be phones, sounds that you can talk about in a general sense. And phoneticians, say phoneticians who are interested in the articulation of sounds, would just talk about phones and not talk about the status, not necessarily talk about the status of those sounds as contrastive entities within a given particular language. Now, if you have a, when one does transcription, say with the International Phonetic Alphabet of a specific language, if you make a purely phonemic transcription of a word or a sentence, that ought to show just the contrastive sounds of the language. So let's take the phrase thousands of audibly distinct sounds spoken in my dialect of English. And in my dialect of English, this sequence shown between the slashes, so between slashes will always show a purely phonemic or underlying representation. And this transcription of that phrase, thousands of audibly distinct sounds, contains only sounds which in my dialect of English are phonemically contrastive. It also includes primary stresses marked here, and we can call these underlying representations. Those underlying representations that contain only the contrastive phonemic sounds of a language can then be operated upon by rules and the fine-grained articulatory phonetics of a language to produce something a bit different. So when we get to a phonetic output, the phonetic notation or the surface representation is going to show at least the major allophonic distinction, and one may also choose to represent phonetic information at various levels of granularity. So if I were to speak this phrase relatively quickly and transcribe it with a relatively high level of phonetic granularity, say thousands of audibly distinct sounds, then we might transcribe it something like this, where we can see the phonetic transcription, yeah, looks appreciably different than what was there in the underlying representation. So to make one interesting note, say let's look at the first part of the word distinct. So in reasonably fast speech in my variety of English, this lax, this high lax vowel I may be deleted, and the sibilant S sound could become syllabic. So we could have a syllable built just around that S. So in terms of trying to go from this underlying representation containing only the contrastive sounds of this variety of English to this surface representation, we need to figure out what phonological processes are occurring. So our goal then in carrying out phonemic analysis is to try to find the system among all of the phonetic detail and try to answer the following question, namely, what is the minimal set of phonological units from which we can derive the full pronunciation of an utterance, whether it's a single word or a larger phrase, by the application of rules. So when we have variants of phonemes that are predictable, and we can predict where certain allophones, certain variants of those phonemes occur using a rule, then we can talk about allophones. There is finer grained phonetic variation that occurs not such a clearly rule-governed fashion, and in those cases, it's not clear we should really speak of major allophones. And importantly here, you can discover allophones using just data from a single speaker. So if you are conducting fieldwork and you only have one native speaker consultant to work with, then you could gather data just from that speaker and look for the distribution of sounds in that data to try to establish what the allophones of the contrastive sounds are. And it's important to note here that phonemic contrast and allophones have absolutely nothing to do with literacy or dialect variation or interspeaker variation. The distinction between phoneme and allophone is a psychological distinction that is going to be present in the grammar of every speaker. But again, it's a subconscious distinction. And as we try to build up towards conducting larger and more complicated analyses of the phonological systems of languages, carrying out phonemic analysis effectively really serves as the core. So it's not going to be possible to write rules that account for the sounds that are present in the phonetic data until we've established what the underlying categories are. So the first step is to, of course, begin with the phonetic data, as we can't take brain scans of people and directly see what phonemes are present there in their brain. We start with those surface forms. We infer from the surface forms what the best underlying representations will be. And once we've said, okay, we have these underlying contrastive categories, and we have these other sounds on the surface, then what rules can we write in order to map, in order to derive a sound occurring on the surface from an underlying contrastive sound? Okay, we'll next come to start using some methods that we can apply to try to discover what the underlying phonemes and their allophones will be.